This is where we start connecting the dots between the labor theory of value as an economic theory and the political implications and alignments around its conclusions. Look, in any given economy, value is created through some combination of labor and organization. The value that's created becomes the wealth that's available within the system. The underlying question then for any political economy is how that wealth is to be distributed. By what mechanism will society determine who gets what share of the wealth created? In a capitalist system, there are two major claimants to the wealth created. First is the worker, the folks who actually do the work that adds value to the goods and services provided. Second are the owners of the means of production, or the capitalists who organizes this labor through their investments. What makes a capitalist economy, however, is that the capitalists get to make the decision as to how the wealth is distributed. Well, it should then come as no surprise that they're often going to decide to take the lion's share of that wealth for themselves. Hence, we have an intrinsic conflict between the workers and the owners. Politics is the domain in which those conflicts inherent in one social arrangement, especially the economy, are mitigated, if not resolved. So in this video and the videos to follow, we're going to look at the major political answers to the questions posed by the labor theory of value in a capitalist system. If we look at politics as taking place on a continuum between an interest in social change for the advancement of humanity on the left and an interest in stability and order for the sake of human well-being on the right, then this video is going to start, bam, right slap dab in the middle by looking at liberalism. I know, according to Fox Noise and the loudest voices on the internet machine, liberalism is a radical far-left ideology. They're wrong. I'll get into the weeds on why in a later project. For now, you have to understand that capitalism as an economic system is central to liberalism as a political philosophy. In fact, we can argue that two of the founders of liberalism are Adam Smith and David Ricardo, important 18th and 19th century contributors to modern economics. In 1776, Adam Smith published his transformative Wealth of Nations, in which he made what at the time was a radical challenge to a king's authority to regulate markets. He wrote that free individuals with a state-protected right to their property will use that property as rationally as they can to advance their own interests. In doing so, they'll improve the lives of everyone around them. He said, "It is not the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests." In other words, the butcher is going to work to get you the best possible cut of meat for the price. If he doesn't, you'll just take your money to another butcher who will. It is therefore in his best interest to find the most efficient way to provide a quality product at the lowest price. Smith and later Ricardo advocated a system by which individuals are free to operate within the marketplace to make the best use of the property they have. The state or the government should have minimal involvement in this system. Not no involvement, as some liberal purists would have you believe, but minimal involvement. Now, Smith and Ricardo do recognize the value of labor in this process. In his Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, Ricardo says, quote, "The value of a commodity depends on the quantity of labor which is necessary for its production." Smith said, quote, "Labor is the first price, the original purchase money that was paid for all things." However, for Smith and Ricardo, labor may be the source of wealth, but the decisions and interactions between buyers and sellers was the best mechanism for distributing that wealth. The artist may labor on a work of art, but if nobody wants to buy it, no value is added. What Smith and Ricardo propose has more or less become the centerpiece of classical liberalism. This is the belief that free individuals acting in their best interests in a competitive marketplace will maximize outcomes for the entire society. The role of the state should be limited to protecting individual rights, including and especially the right to property, but also speech and worship and just that kind of stuff too. For the most part, this remains the view of European liberals. And they were right. The rise of capitalism in an increasingly classically liberal world did in fact spur an exponential rise in material wealth and technological advancement, the likes of which have never been experienced in all of human history. An individual reading Wealth of Nations in 1776 could hardly imagine what the world would look like just 100 years later. For liberals, this was the result of a system that incentivized investment, entrepreneurship, and innovation. But this material advancement came at a considerable cost. In privileging the capitalists in this system, much of the wealth created ended up in the private coffers of especially wealthy individuals. And it turns out that the wealthier one becomes, the less the accumulation of that wealth rests on risk and innovation, and more on market and even political power. This power is then used to exploit labor. Monopolies and trusts began to consolidate and wield both political and economic power. As Woodrow Wilson said, quote, "If there are men in this country big enough to own the government of the United States, they are going to own it." The costs of this system fell disproportionately on working people. As Ricardo pointed out in what later became known as the Iron Law of Wages, the natural wage laborers will be able to command in a capitalist system is nothing more than bare subsistence. Anything less will not attract workers, but anything more will attract so many workers as to drive the value of labor back down. Laborers were locked into a cycle of poverty that was very difficult to overcome, regardless of personal merit. They often lived in squalor and improvised unsanitary and unsafe slums. Their young children consigned to work in the factories. Any illness, any accident, an entire family can become destitute on the spot. Such was the life of a worker from the moment they were old enough to work until their bodies gave out if they were lucky enough to live to some kind of old age. In such a system, it was natural for those locked in poverty to decide to burn the system down. The entirety of the 19th century was marked by disruptive and even violent labor uprisings, not the least of which in the United States was the Great Railroad Uprising of 1877 and the coal wars of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Radical leftist ideologies like socialism, communism, and anarchism became increasingly popular. The cost of maintaining the system through state violence and military intervention became destabilizing. Liberals realized that changes had to be made if capitalism were to be preserved. Yes, liberals still believed in limited state intervention, but began to debate the extent of those limits. Starting in the late 19th century, American liberals advanced a theory of preserving capitalism through targeted state intervention. Republican President Theodore Roosevelt advocated state intervention to break up monopolies, and even advanced the interests of organized labor, so long as they didn't get too lefty. Later movements advocated for and won child labor laws, compulsory education, minimum wages, and the right to collective bargaining. During the Great Depression, facing a total collapse of capitalism, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and reform-minded progressive liberals instituted significant state interventions in an attempt to level the playing field. Questions raised by the labor theory of value, particularly who should receive the gains from increased productivity, became central to debates surrounding the New Deal. Economists pointed out that if workers made more money, were able to claim a higher share of the surplus value they created, then they would spend more money and create a virtuous cycle by which their spending increased profits, which would increase wages, that would then increase spending, in turn resulting in more profits. This virtuous cycle could be catalyzed in the workplace by increasing labor power through collective bargaining. In the marketplace, progressive and redistributive taxation was used to support social safety nets and public goods to sustain a reasonable standard of living, especially for those who fell through the cracks. Today, American liberalism still privileges the prerogatives of capital over labor. Investors should be encouraged to invest, and that means they should be able to direct the limits of their investments as they see fit. However, liberals also understand that workers deserve a larger piece of the economic pie than the owners may be willing to share on their own. A system in which workers are locked into bare subsistence incentivizes destructive impulses over hard work. The state must intervene to the extent that hard work is a road to personal advancement. Toward this end, the government must limit the power of the ownership class and ensure a fair allocation for public goods and provide social safety nets, again, for those falling through the cracks. This is the formula for every successful market in the world, by the way. Regulated capitalism embedded in a system that empowers labor to demand a greater share of the surplus value and a distribution of wealth through the provision of public goods and social safety nets paid for through progressive taxation. The debate revolves around the limits. To what extent should labor be empowered? How much wealth should be distributed? What is the balance between the provision of public goods and social safety nets and the responsibility of the individual to provide for themselves? At what point might state support become state dependence? How might such programs limit human freedom and independence? To what extent should the individual be responsible for their own success, and what systems need to be in place to guarantee discipline and social order in the face of economic failure? Look, these are all good questions. The next video will look at mainstream conservatism as a response to liberal economic interventionism.